The forest was thick with a silence that pressed against their ears, and each breath of wind carried the sharp bite of the Russian winter. Lena Carter crouched beneath the shadow of a snow-laden pine, her old rifle resting at her side, a piece of history amid the sleek, modern weapons of her comrades. She was used to the cold, to the weight of a mission that could turn deadly at a moment's notice. But today the mission seemed more weighted than usual. A mockery had come from the younger scouts earlier in the evening. The old rifle, an heirloom from her first spotter, Grace, had been the subject of their jokes. "Does that antique even fire?" someone had laughed, their voice cutting through the otherwise still air. Lena hadn't reacted. She only wiped down the scope, as though preparing for a ritual. Her rifle had seen death and survival alike, more than her comrades could ever know. They had no understanding of what it meant to trust something so thoroughly. The laughter faded quickly as the winds picked up, but it was not forgotten. Not for Lena. She could feel the weight of it, even now, beneath the steady hum of the wind in the trees. The mission remained the same: find the downed helicopter crew, extract them, and move on. But as the storm rolled in with a fury, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this mission than they were being told. There always was. She kept her rifle close, watching the movements around her. The forest wasn't just alive with the storm, it was alive with the faintest shift in the snow, the smallest deviation in the sound of wind. Her comrades, moving in coordinated precision, trusted the environment around them. But Lena trusted her instincts more. She had learned that silence could mean something, and in this silence she felt the past stir. Memories of Grace, of mistakes, of debts that could never be paid. This rifle, simple but reliable, was her connection to everything she had lost and everything she still needed to protect. As the team moved into position, Lena knew this was not just another mission. This was survival. The past had taught her how to live through the worst, and in this frozen world, the lessons would be tested once again. The cold began to gnaw at their bones as the team advanced through the narrow corridor of snow between the ridges. The wind howled, slicing through layers of clothing, turning exposed skin to ice. Lena moved silently, the old rifle steady in her hands, her breath slow and controlled. Each step in the snow was deliberate, the crisp crunch of boots muffled by the sheer force of the storm. Keller led them forward, constantly checking the map and compass, his movements precise and measured. They had to reach the downed helicopter crew before the storm closed in completely. The snow was deep, forcing them to lift each foot high, careful not to stumble. Every step was exhausting, but they pressed on. Their objective was clear, but the forest, thick with the scent of ice and pine, seemed to be holding its breath. At the front of the line, Keller called for a halt. The team paused, taking short, measured sips from their water bottles, careful not to let the cold air fog their breath. Hannah and Joel, the medics, checked on the team's condition, making sure no one had started to sweat through their base layers. Sweat in this kind of cold was a death sentence, and every soldier knew it. Lena remained still, her eyes scanning the perimeter. The storm was becoming more intense, visibility shrinking by the minute. She knew their time was running out. They had to move faster. The ground beneath them was frozen solid now, and each step felt like it could be their last. But the mission was far from over. As they resumed their journey, Lena's mind drifted briefly to the past, to the lessons she had learned in these kinds of conditions. Grace had taught her to never take anything for granted, especially in the cold. The cold didn't care about the best gear, the most advanced technology, or even skill. It only cared about survival. She focused on the task at hand, moving in perfect synchronization with her team. The tension between them was palpable, but there was no time for distractions. Their lives depended on getting to that crash site and getting out. But even as they moved, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt too quiet, the wind too steady. They were being watched. The thought made her tighten her grip on her rifle. The mission had turned into something more. It had turned into a test of survival, and Lena wasn't going to fail it. The silence between the team members was thick, almost oppressive, as they navigated the narrow pass through the forest. Lena's every sense was attuned to the surroundings, but even with her heightened awareness, there was no way to predict what would happen next. The storm raged harder now, the wind howling through the trees with a ferocity that made the already treacherous terrain even more dangerous. Visibility was reduced to nothing, and each member of the team was forced to rely on their instincts and their training. Keller's orders were sharp and efficient, each move calculated to keep the group together and safe. The snow crunched underfoot, the sound of their boots the only break in the wind's constant wail. Lena's old rifle, a constant companion through countless operations, was now more than just a tool. It was a reminder of everything she had learned, everything she had lost. As the team trudged forward, their pace slow and deliberate, the weight of the mission pressed down on them. The crash site was still several kilometers away, and with every step, the cold seemed to seep deeper into their bones. The air was thick with tension, but no one spoke. The storm was a wall around them, and each breath felt harder to take. Keller led the group as they moved through the snowdrifts, the map now a mere formality. There was no time to debate the path forward. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows of the trees swallowing them whole. Lena's eyes remained fixed ahead, but her mind wandered. The past was never far away. Grace's voice echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the lessons that had kept her alive. Never trust the cold, never trust anything that doesn't feel right. Keep your head down and your rifle steady. Lena had learned that lesson well. The old rifle in her hands was the tool she had trusted, the tool that had never failed her. But she knew that trust could be fragile, especially in the chaos of a mission like this. They had to reach the crash site, but the storm had a way of erasing everything in its path. The forest was no longer just a backdrop. It was a living, breathing entity that could turn on them at any moment. The team moved closer to the ridge, where the wind began to die down just enough for them to feel the tension in the air. They were close. Too close. But still, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for them to make a mistake. As they neared the ridge, Lena's gut tightened with an unease she couldn't shake. The wind had died down slightly, but the cold had only deepened. The snow beneath them, which had been trudged through for hours, now felt like an unforgiving mirror of the darkness ahead. Keller signaled for a brief pause, and the team huddled together for warmth. The fire they had tried to start earlier flickered weakly, barely offering any comfort against the howling storm. As the team settled into their positions, Lena's eyes scanned the surrounding forest, her every sense alert. The trees, tall and heavy with snow, seemed to loom closer than before, pressing in on them. She adjusted her rifle, the old metal cold against her fingers. The others began to settle, checking gear, checking each other for signs of exhaustion or frostbite. The weight of their journey was evident on their faces, but there was no time to rest. Lena didn't speak, but she could sense the tension in the air, felt it rising in the silent glances exchanged between the soldiers. They were all thinking the same thing. They were too exposed here. They had to move. Her thoughts flickered back to Grace once again. It had been years since she lost her first spotter, the one who had taught her how to survive when everything else seemed to fall apart. The lessons Grace had passed on to her, the harsh reality of survival in a world that didn't care about anything except getting through the next moment, still rang in Lena's mind. Keep moving, never stop, trust your training, trust your rifle. She felt the weight of those lessons as if they were carved into her bones, and they pushed her forward as the storm began to pick up again. Keller moved first, his figure swallowed up by the swirling snow, and the team followed. Every step was calculated, every movement tense. They couldn't afford to waste time. The ridge was ahead, the crash site still a distant hope, but the way the wind had shifted made Lena's skin crawl. They were no longer alone. There was something in the air, a presence that wasn't natural. Lena's grip tightened on her rifle, her breath steady, her mind focused. She had learned long ago that silence in the forest could mean danger. And tonight, the silence felt louder than it ever had before. The storm intensified, its howling wind swallowing all sound except for the crunch of their boots in the snow. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself was dragging them deeper into its grip. The team pressed on, their bodies moving on autopilot, trained for moments like this. Keller kept the front, his movements sharp, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The others followed, one step at a time, their faces drawn tight with cold and exhaustion. Lena trailed at the rear, her rifle always in hand, always steady. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. Every shift in the wind, every crack of a branch, made her pulse quicken. The forest had a way of hiding its secrets, and tonight it was hiding more than just their tracks. The memory of Grace's lessons, of trust, survival, and the heavy responsibility of being the last line of defense, weighed on Lena. She had learned the hard way that in the cold, trust was everything, and tonight it was all she had. They moved through the snow at a crawl, their bodies stiff from hours of exposure. Keller signaled for another stop, his eyes scanning the tree line. This was it. They were close. The ridge was just ahead, but something felt wrong. The forest felt wrong. The wind had shifted again, and the snow had begun to swirl in unpredictable patterns. Lena felt the tension rise in her chest as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. They were being watched. The thought was there, lurking beneath the surface of her mind, but she couldn't put a finger on it. It wasn't just the cold, it wasn't just the storm, it was something more. The team adjusted its position as they made their way toward the ridge. The snow was deeper here, and each step felt like it was dragging them under. They were so close to the crash site now, so close to their goal, but Lena knew better than to assume anything. There were always variables, and in her experience, variables were the things that got you killed. The wind howled again, this time louder, as if the forest was warning them. Lena's heart began to race, her pulse thumping in her ears. She could feel the presence now, the same way she felt it on that mission with Grace years ago, when things had gone wrong, when trust had been broken and lives had been lost. But this time, it was different. This time, Lena was alone. She was the last one standing from her old team, and the weight of that history bore down on her more heavily with each passing second. The forest pressed in around them, and Lena felt a quiet resolve settle into her chest. The enemy was out there. They always were. And tonight, they wouldn't get the best of her. She would make sure of it. The team moved forward again, a little faster now, as if the storm itself had given them a sense of urgency. The ridge was in sight, and with it the faint trace of broken branches, signs that they were nearing the downed crew. But even as hope flickered, Lena's instincts told her that something was coming. The forest wasn't done with them yet. The ridge loomed ahead, but the storm seemed to grow heavier with every step. Lena's eyes stayed fixed on the snow, on the faintest signs of movement that could mean danger. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees with renewed force, but this time it was different. The snow was thicker, harder, and it felt like the world was closing in on them. Lena's heartbeat quickened. She wasn't sure if it was the storm or something else, but something felt wrong. They had made it this far, but there was no guarantee they would make it out. The team had slowed their pace, each member more cautious now. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. Keller had ordered a quick break, just a moment to gather their thoughts before they reached the ridge. The time for silence was over. They were nearing the crash site, but the forest seemed unwilling to let them reach it unscathed. Lena crouched low, her rifle held tight against her chest. She wiped the fog from her scope, then peered through it, scanning the tree line. Every shadow felt like an enemy. Every gust of wind seemed to carry the scent of danger. Her pulse raced in her ears, but her hand stayed steady. There was no room for panic in moments like this. There was only focus. There was only survival. As the others caught their breath, Lena's mind raced. Grace's voice echoed once more in her mind. "Stay sharp, Lena. Trust your instincts. They'll guide you." But what if her instincts were wrong? What if this wasn't just another mission, but a trap? The thought gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't afford doubts. Not now. Keller signaled again, this time to move forward. The ridge was close now. Their goal was within reach, but the storm was relentless. Visibility was reduced to just a few feet in front of them. The crash site could be just around the corner, but the world around them had turned into a maze of snow and wind. They kept moving, single file, each member of the team focused on the steps ahead. Lena kept her position at the back, her eyes darting between the team and the dark outline of the trees. The old rifle was a comfort in her hands, its cold metal familiar and steady. Her mind kept going back to Grace, to the lessons learned in that hard, frozen place. In those moments, trust wasn't just about your weapon or your training, it was about the team. And this team, no matter how fractured, had to trust each other to make it through. The thought settled in her chest, as heavy and as real as the rifle she held. Trust was all they had left. And that was enough. The team pressed on. their steps sinking deep into the snow. The ridge was only moments away, but with each step, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them. The ridge was finally within sight, but the journey felt endless. Lena's legs were numb from the cold, her body stiff with exhaustion, but she kept moving. The storm had turned from a nuisance to a relentless force, swallowing everything in its path. The forest around them was shrouded in white, the trees nothing more than dark shapes against the whirling snow. Lena's thoughts were sharp, her senses stretched thin, as though the storm itself was conspiring to blur reality. But the mission was clear: find the downed crew, get them out. Nothing else mattered. As they neared the ridge, the silence around them became even more pronounced. The wind had died down a little, but the snow seemed to thicken, each flake a small threat. Keller raised his hand for the group to stop, his eyes scanning the trees. There was something different in the air now. The team was close, but Lena felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She wasn't the only one. The others moved quietly, checking gear and weapons, eyes darting over the snow-covered ground. The crash site should have been just ahead, but the air had a strange weight to it. Lena didn't like it. They weren't alone anymore. She could feel it. The forest was too still, the shadows too dark. Every moment stretched as long as a lifetime, the sound of her own breath in her ears louder than it had ever been. She lowered her body closer to the snow, her rifle steady in her hands, and took a deep breath. The forest held its breath too. Keller motioned for them to move out again, his voice low and steady, but the tension in the air was palpable. They were no longer just hunting for the crew. They were hunting something else, something that was hunting them. Lena moved quietly, every step calculated to avoid making noise. But the snow seemed to protest under her boots. Every sound felt like a betrayal, every breath was a risk. They pressed on, moving swiftly but cautiously, always staying alert. The crash site had to be close now. But there was something about the way the forest had closed in around them that made it seem further away than it was. The trees pressed in from all sides, their heavy branches creating a dark canopy that made the world below feel claustrophobic. The forest wasn't just cold, it was suffocating. They were almost there. Lena knew it, but so did whatever was watching them. The team moved as one, their coordinated steps a sign of the bond that had formed between them in the heat of battle. They were a unit, and they would make it out, together. But even as Lena moved, her instincts screamed at her to stay sharp. The calm before the storm was always the most dangerous. And tonight, the storm had already broken. The tension was unbearable, each moment stretching as they neared the crash site. The storm had all but swallowed the world, leaving only the dark shapes of the trees and the biting cold to remind them that the forest was alive. Keller held his hand up, signaling the team to stop once more. The forest, which had been eerily quiet, now felt suffocating. The faint rustling of snow beneath their boots was the only sound. Lena crouched low, scanning the area ahead. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with the weight of the storm. The crash site should have been just beyond the next rise, but Lena's gut told her that something was wrong. Her instincts, honed through years of training, screamed at her to stay alert. She gripped her rifle tighter, every muscle in her body coiled and ready. Keller motioned for them to move again, but Lena held back for a moment, her eyes scanning the shadowed forest. Her breath came in shallow bursts, the cold air stinging her lungs. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But there was no time for hesitation. They had come too far. The team pushed forward, climbing the ridge slowly, methodically. Every step was careful, calculated. They were close now, so close to the downed crew, but the weight of the moment bore down on them. The storm was their enemy, but the forest held secrets of its own. As they crested the ridge, the first signs of the crash appeared. A broken helicopter rotor, a flash of orange fabric caught on a tree. Lena's heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment she allowed herself a breath of relief. But it was fleeting. The area around the crash site was open, exposed. The team needed cover, and they needed it fast. They had made it this far, but the hardest part was still ahead. Keller quickly began issuing orders, but Lena's eyes were already scanning the tree line. She could feel it, the sense that they were no longer alone. The shadows beneath the trees shifted in the wind, and she couldn't help but feel that something was moving with them. It was subtle, but it was there. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and her hand instinctively tightened around her rifle. They had reached the downed crew, but now Lena knew the real mission was just beginning. The enemy was closing in. And the storm, as fierce as it was, had only just begun. The forest, once a silent observer, had become their predator. Lena's instincts screamed at her as she kept her eyes on the tree line, her senses sharpened to a razor's edge. The downed crew was mere feet away, but the sense of danger grew with each passing second. Keller had ordered the team to form a tight perimeter around the crash site, but Lena felt as if the walls were closing in on them. Every movement, every shift in the wind made her heart race. The old rifle in her hands felt heavier than ever before. She knew that survival wasn't just about getting to the crash site, it was about getting out alive. The storm's howl had intensified again, the gusts sharp and cold, but it also seemed to carry with it a deeper silence. The team moved quickly, efficiently, but every member was aware of the growing tension. The forest had never seemed more alive, more aware of them. Lena's eyes flicked from shadow to shadow, the snow-covered ground providing no cover, no refuge. The crash site, though a small victory, had become a trap, and Lena felt the weight of that realization settle into her chest. The downed crew, though injured and exhausted, were now their responsibility. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. As Keller and the medics worked to stabilize the crew, Lena crouched low, her rifle at the ready, eyes darting between the dark silhouettes of the trees. The enemy was out there, she knew it, but they were patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She had learned long ago that in the cold, patience could be as dangerous as a bullet. Her mind raced through possible scenarios, each one more grim than the last. The team needed to move, but they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The forest would punish them for any misstep. Lena scanned the horizon again, feeling the weight of time pressing down on her. She glanced back at Keller, who was still focused on the injured crew, his back to the forest. Lena's grip tightened on her rifle, her breath steady despite the growing pressure. The forest was closing in. And with it, the cold truth. They weren't just fighting the storm. They were fighting something far worse, something that had been watching them for a long time. She didn't know how much time they had left, but every second counted. They had to move. Now! Lena's breath was steady, but her pulse quickened as she watched the team work. The crash site, though now occupied by the wounded crew and the medics, felt exposed. Every shadow seemed deeper, every tree more menacing. Keller was focused on the crew, moving with practiced efficiency as he ensured that they were stabilized for transport. But Lena knew with a certainty that came only from experience, that the danger was far from over. They weren't out of the forest yet. The wind howled again, the storm obscuring all but the faintest outlines of the world around them. But the real enemy wasn't the weather. It was the silence, the waiting, the steady pressure of the forest that had kept them on edge since the moment they first set foot in it. The rifle in Lena's hands felt like an extension of herself, cold and familiar, but tonight it wasn't just a tool for survival. It was a lifeline. The minutes stretched on as the medics finished their work, and Keller began organizing the evacuation. The team was ready to move, but Lena felt that shift in the air once more, a presence. They had been followed, she could feel it in her bones. The tension in the camp was palpable, and Lena's mind raced, calculating the steps ahead, planning for every possibility. The wind had shifted again, and the snow began to swirl in new patterns. The forest, now eerily quiet, seemed to hold its breath. Lena caught sight of the others, their movements deliberate but tense. They knew. They could all feel it. This was no longer just about completing the mission. It was about surviving long enough to escape. The helicopter was on its way, but Lena knew that time was against them. The first sign of movement came from the shadows, a shape too deliberate, too purposeful to be natural. Her rifle was ready before her mind had fully processed the thought, her finger poised on the trigger. But Lena didn't fire. Not yet. She watched. The team's movements grew more synchronized, more urgent as they began to retreat towards the extraction point. The air felt thick with anticipation, each breath a fleeting hope. And then, in the distance, the sound of rotors. The helicopter was coming, but would it arrive in time? The forest was closing in, the storm thickening again. The line between survival and death was razor thin, and Lena knew that their fate would be decided in the next few moments. They had come too far to fail now. The unit moved swiftly, purposefully, and Lena held her ground. She fired when she had to, precise and controlled, her old rifle true as always. But as the first light of dawn crept into the sky, the helicopter reached them. They had made it. But Lena knew that this mission, like all the others before it, had taken a cost. A toll that wasn't measured in steps, but in the weight of every decision made in the silence of the snow. The team boarded the helicopter, each member as worn as the next, but they were alive. And as the aircraft rose into the air, Lena couldn't help but think of Grace, of the lessons learned, and of the rifle that had kept them all breathing through the night. The forest below grew smaller and smaller, swallowed by the storm, and for the first time in hours, Lena allowed herself to relax. The mission was over. For now, the silence of the forest, the cold grip of survival, would return. But for today they had won. Если эта история тронула вас эмоционально, подпишитесь на наш канал, напишите свое мнение в комментариях и поделитесь этим видео с другими.